Hello everyone, it's about that time again, time where I start off a new Let's Play, and just like with my previous Let's Play, I'm going to be doing an introduction video before I actually get into any of the main content. This time I'm going to be going back to a game that I did 2 LPs ago, which got quite a bit of good reception from a lot of people and brought a lot of new viewers to my channel, that being Star Wars Rogue Squadron. This game is developed by the same people, or was developed by the same people, a few years later after a certain sequel, or rather prequel, had come out in theaters. Nintendo and Lucasarts had signed a 3-game agreement that meant that Lucasarts would develop games over a certain period exclusively for the Nintendo 64. However, that agreement was beginning to run out. Star Wars Rogue Squadron and Star Wars Episode 1 Racer had been released as of 1999 in early February or so. At about that time, LucasArts and Factor 5 started testing for a follow-up game to their already successful Rogue Squadron. They started from the ground up. Now that they knew what system they were going to be developing for, they could build an entirely new game engine to take advantage of the N64's strengths and weaknesses and do things that no one else was able to do on the system. They got their plot ideas directly from Lucasfilm, who dictated that any game that they made would have to tie in with the movie that they had coming out, Star Wars Episode 1: The Phantom Menace. The movie was released in May of the same year, and the Factor 5 team watched the movie many times in attempts to find interesting characters, vehicles, and situations to make a game about. According to interviews with the team, they found it difficult to be able to do anything that hadn't already been done in other games, such as the Episode 1 Racer game or the Episode 1 tie-in game that had been developed for PlayStation and for computer. At the same time, LucasArts pushed for this. Factor 5 had no choice but to develop a game specifically about Star Wars Episode 1. So Factor 5 did so. They took all of the characters and vehicles from the movie that they could and mixed those elements in to a game with a lot of entirely new content, which they based on a lot of LucasArts concept designs and other things that had been unused in the final movie. LucasArts themselves supplied a lot of the art and level design for the game, while Factor 5 worked on more or less everything else. A lot of what they did with this game that would end up resulting were technical things that could not have been possible on the Rogue Squadron engine, which they had developed without the N64 particularly in mind. The game was released in the year 2000 to almost universal acclaim across the board. The N64 version of this game currently has an 84 on Metacritic and won 2 Editor's Choice Awards that year, one from GamePro and one from IGN. Several reviews are still on archive about this game that you can read for yourself if you do a little bit of Googling. This game has been praised almost universally as a great spiritual successor to Rogue Squadron, but not without some flaws. Opinions were divided on whether or not the storyline and the characters were at all compelling. Some people thought they were, and some people thought they weren't, especially compared to Rogue Squadrons. Also, opinion was very greatly divided on how the different missions were paced and whether the additions of new types of vehicles and new forms of slightly different forms of combat were needed or were just unnecessary additions that wound up dragging the gameplay down. The game's visuals were a major source of disagreement. Many people considered the much improved draw distance and abilities of the game's brand new game engine to be a vast improvement over Rogue Squadron. However, some people complained that the formula of Rogue Squadron's graphics had not been changed enough to take advantage of the improved game engine, and that the graphics were just as bad or just as good as Rogue Squadron, for better or worse. Things that were universally praised were the game's sound design and its music. Factor 5 became known after Rogue Squadron for being able to max out the abilities of the Nintendo 64 sound processor, and this game only furthered that reputation. However, the game was ported to the PC about 2 months later, but this version of the game is still almost universally derided, having a 54 rating on Metacritic. The problem is that since the game was specifically developed for the Nintendo 64, the fact that the PC version was a port instead of being developed for the computer as the Rogue Squadron version was, a lot of its capabilities suffered. The PC version of the game suffers from bland, flat, and low-res textures and bad-looking 2D sprites that, while looking impressive for the N64, for computer games of the era were just plain bad. Similar complaints were raised about the audio of the game, which was described by a GameSpot reviewer as not being bad, but not nearly as good as audio in similar games, and of course being tinny. Considering that it was ported from drivers specifically meant for the N64, this is rather understandable. Another thing that was almost universally derided was the PC version's controls, which had not been adjusted at all to compensate for the increased sensitivity of using a mouse and keyboard, as opposed to the Nintendo 64's analog stick. Even PC players who used a controller or a joystick found the game almost uncontrollable. Star Wars Episode 1 Battle for Naboo is a game with a mixed legacy. Compared to the Rogue Squadron games, it left almost no footprint on gaming history aside from being one of the best looking and best reviewed games in the late era N64, at least in the area of space flight simulators and arcade games. This is going to be the game that we're going to be looking at. I'm going to be playing through the N64 version of Star Wars Episode 1 Battle for Naboo. Unlike my previous Let's Play of Rogue Squadron, however, I will not be focusing on getting most of the gold medals, as I instead will be going through the game in a more casual manner and show all of the content that I am not able to show during the gameplay itself via the game's in-game cheats. Because, quite frankly, unless you're an absolute master at this game, there's no way you're going to be able to show everything within one playthrough. There simply is not any way. And I'll tell you why as soon as we dive a little bit deeper into Star Wars Episode 1 Battle for Naboo.